thank you, TEDx, and thank you, U of T, especially U of T, which is all around me here. A lot of people worked very hard to make this possible. I hope they are having fun in arranging it. I just came from another event where I was in the audience, and the speaker was a chap whose name is Steven Pinker, and on the bookshelf outside there are two of his books, and that was a real sellout. And Steven Pinker is a professor of psychology at Harvard. He's a Canadian emigre, and he came back to talk about his current idea, which is, I think, entirely valid, which is that this is the most humane and peaceful period in the whole history of humankind. Violence, he says, is out of fashion. So he gave a very good talk about this. I mean, his point is, you know, we've never been before so considerate of women, of minorities, of handicapped, even animals. You shouldn't be cruel to animals, and so on. It's something new, and it's something that's here to stay. And it was very heartening. And then there came question and answer period, which unfortunately we don't have here. And we lined up at the speaker, and a plaintive young woman said, well, you know, if everything's going that well, is there anything left to do, Professor Pinker? And I was right behind her, waiting for my turn to ask a question. And I said, well, you know, perhaps we could reduce the number of nuclear weapons from 20,000 downwards, and in this peaceful, humane, and kindly situation which we're in. And actually, Steven Pinker was honest enough to say, actually, he said, I was going to mention that, but it slipped my mind. Well, so, you know, I was reinforced in the idea that I have a role in this event, and further reinforced when my grandson arrived just now and told me that North Korea has just fired 3 missiles which are intended ultimately to carry nuclear warheads. Well, I mean, they're a bunch of out-of-control lunatics and not capable of doing any serious harm as yet. The story that I have to tell, and I have to tell it in the right time, so I better think about that. The story I have to tell begins really quite recently. I mean, the nuclear era started summer of 1945, and I was a schoolboy at Manchester Grammar School. And one day in the newspaper, I think it was August 6th, 1945, it said, a plane has gone over Hiroshima and dropped a bomb, and Hiroshima no longer exists. And then 3 days later, it said, one more plane has gone over Nagasaki, and Nagasaki no longer exists. Actually, 190,000 people were killed in by those two bombs, which today would be considered small nuclear weapons. And I'm going to take a chance and digress just for a moment, because there are some experts in this audience, and I wonder if you've thought about the fact that 2 nuclear bombs were dropped, not 1. I mean, one could start to think we had to give a terrible shock to Japan, otherwise in that fanatical environment they would never have given up. But 2, why did we drop 2? Well, I can tell you the answer, because I'm a scientist and I was actually taught by the guys who made those bombs in Alamogordo Desert and at Los Alamos. They made 2 kinds of bombs. They made a uranium bomb and they made a plutonium bomb. So it's a no-brainer. Of course they had to drop 2 bombs. They'd made 2 kinds of bombs. And so I think that message should stay with you. The bombs one has tend to be by inertia used. Well, you know, when those bombs were dropped, President Truman broadcast on the day the second one was dropped, 9th of August, 1945. And here is what he said. He said, it's an awful responsibility that has come upon us. And he was right. And then he went on, and this has a slight dating to it 70 years ago. He said, "We thank God that it's come upon us, the United States, and not on our enemies." Well, okay, I'd rather it came to the United States. What about those enemies? Well, something good has happened in the intervening 70 years. The dark areas of the world are becoming streaked with light. Education is making people more reasonable. That's really what Steven Pinker was talking about. People are educated. You people are educated very highly. So it isn't hard for you to see when a bomb drops that actually you might not be the person dropping the bomb. You might be the person on whom it's dropped. That's a feat of imagination, and that's what we teach you at the university at the end of 4 years. So this education level has changed the world. It has brought democracy to a large part of the world. So what are the threats that the President of the United States at the time, Truman, was talking about? Well, they're really threats of our own making. One, environment in the longer range. And two, nuclear weapons in the shorter range. And somehow we're forgetting about nuclear weapons, but it is a real threat. And you might say, well, is it really? I mean, it's true there are 20,000, but it's all part of deterrence. It's not, nobody intends to use them. But you can't have it both ways. You can't have meaningful, credible deterrence and structure things so that those weapons are not ready for use. At the moment, they're far too ready for use. But the thing is that they are part of the warfighting capability and intent of quite a lot of nations. So what are we to do to live under this sword of Damocles? And there are two things we should do. One is to stabilize that sword as much as we can so it doesn't fall on our heads, and the other is to remove it, and that's called disarmament. How are we doing in the stabilization front? Not well at all, because we are suffering from the same sort of idiot inertia that caused us to drop 2 bombs because we had 2 bombs. We have, actually, to be specific, the United States and Russia, as a legacy of the Cold War, have thousands of nuclear weapons which are on the alert, ready for firing in a matter of minutes, which means that nobody's going to be asked because nobody can be found and nobody can think in a few minutes. So that's the situation, and that has been the situation for some years. It's a crying scandal, and we should object to it and we should alter it. There's no reason why those weapons should be on the alert. That is destabilizing. Second element, disarmament. That's really an attempt to delegitimize the possession of these weapons. And it should be easy because, I mean, they're disgusting. And but if you want more cogent reason, the International Court in The Hague was consulted, and it said that to use those weapons at all would be a crime against humanity. Of course it would. They are indiscriminate and cruel beyond belief. So delegitimizing them shouldn't be that hard. When the Boston killing took place a few weeks ago, President Obama said, any time bombs are used to target innocent civilians, it is an act of terrorism, a crime, therefore. And he didn't go on to say what was in my mind and what I'd like to leave perhaps in yours, namely that nuclear weapons are of the same sort. Well, the picture at the moment is that the loftiest status is given to those powers that have nuclear weapons. And those powers that have nuclear weapons, a bit complicated. There are the official and the unofficial. It doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference, but the official ones are 5. They are US, Russia, China, UK, and France. Is that 5? Yes, it is. And they are, by right of the fact that they have these disgusting weapons, permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, the highest body in the world, we hope, in the matter of exerting power. Well, of course, that has tempted others to join the club, and there are at present 4 more who are not official members: India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea that I mentioned at the opening. So that's 9 in all, with a 10th one crowding up, which is Iran. And I think that's a very real likelihood that Iran, out of national pride, will keep going, will get some nuclear weapons. And Israel and the United States are threatening to teach them restraint by bombing their nuclear facilities, which actually means bombing quite widely, very widely. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake, first of all, because bombs are not good teachers of restraint, and bombs that are wielded by nations that are nuclear powers, Israel, United States nuclear powers, and that are being wielded in order to persuade other nations that they should not get the same weapons that the nations that are bombing them have. It isn't a very probable outcome that they say, I see your point. But there's a further problem, and it's very serious, and that is that to take such action, it's called preemptive strike. It means that you see a threat and you act with force. And that takes you back to the law of the jungle. In the jungle, there are wild beasts all around the place, and they might, at some future point, attack you. So attack them first. But you cannot have a world which is livable and peaceable in which preemption is allowed. We've gone to a lot of effort to make preemption outlawed. Actually, you know, we were invited to preempt at the time when Stalin got nuclear weapons, and I remember it well. And Bertrand Russell, who actually was sort of a friend of mine because through Pugwash, Bertrand Russell, the most pacific person you can imagine, he was a pacifist to the core. He said, attack Russia. Logic demands it. Now we have our chance. Preempt. Well, we didn't. Bertrand Russell was wrong. He regretted it afterwards. Great men can be wrong. And by desisting, we allowed history to unfold. The Soviet Union disappeared. We did the same thing with Mao. Mao was every bit as threatening, every bit as anxious for world dominion, and we held back, and China will develop in a more favorable way. It would have been a disaster to preempt, and the same applies to Iran. So what about it? Can we have disarmament? It's not a dream. In 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, Iceland, and they agreed. I mean, you may find it incredible, but it's true. They agreed to destroy all their nuclear weapons in a 10-year period with one proviso. And that one proviso was that neither side should build anti-missile defenses, because then you don't know where you are. How good are their defenses? How good, therefore, are our offensive? Their serious doubts are raised. The United States couldn't accept that because Reagan had become convinced that a Star Wars shield was a good thing. So the whole effort collapsed. And I mention it for 2 reasons. One, this government that we have in Ottawa is quietly flirting with the United States on the subject of missile defense, seeing whether we couldn't show that we are friends by collaborating in missile defense. We shouldn't do it. It's a very bad idea. It's a spoiler in any effort, therefore, thereafter to disarm. And Canada, in its past history, has recognized that. Canada should recognize it in its future history. Second reason is that I wanted to make it clear that scientists have a responsibility in this story. I mentioned Reagan being devoted to missile defense, which I have excoriated, and I've done that for many, many years, starting actually in 1960 through an organization called Pugwash, which had its headquarters in Pugwash, Nova Scotia, and which won a Nobel Peace Prize and some Canadians noticed. And it wasn't just a Canadian organization, or it would have been useless. It was a worldwide organization. But it did have its home in Pugwash, Nova Scotia. What was the second point I was trying to make? It was that the person who convinced President Reagan that missile defense was going to protect the United States was a chap who I subsequently debated in Ottawa in front of Pierre Trudeau, namely Edward Teller. And he wasn't alone in this. He had lots of allies who said, you know, physics is great. We can knock down those missiles. Well, he was wrong, because we can knock down a half. We can perhaps, given favorable circumstances, if they tell us what missiles they're going to send, when, and from where, we can knock down maybe 3/4. It doesn't make any difference. The disaster is beyond history that would ensue from the residual nuclear weapons. So don't get sucked in by the fantasy of missile defense. It's a very damaging one, a very costly one, a very retrograde one. Well, you know, why don't we disarm? Well, one reason is that there are a lot of people who have huge sums of money invested in armaments, and that President Eisenhower made his greatest speech saying, watch out for the military-industrial complex. There's another reason we don't disarm, and that may be more present in this room, and it's respectable enough, and that is that nuclear weapons have kept the peace to some extent till now. They have stayed many hands that might otherwise have initiated war. But what we have to worry about are those hands that through miscalculation or misunderstanding, when, as in the last day, a nation starts firing nuclear weapons, or when there is some tension over Taiwan, which the United States has thoroughly guaranteed it will go to the aid of, and China has thoroughly guaranteed it will make part of mainland China, or between North and South, between Pakistan and India and so on. There is a very dangerous situation, and we cannot rely on nuclear weapons in the long run. It would be criminal so to do. And we're not all complacent. Let me end now before somebody drags me by my leg off this stage. In 2009, which is even within your living memory, 3 years ago, 3.5, President Obama gave a marvelous speech in front of a great mob in a square in Prague, a mob of people who had been in the thick of the last war and knew what war was about. And he said this. He said, we, the United States, as the only nuclear power to have used a nuclear weapon, have a responsibility to act. Today, I state, said Obama, clearly and with conviction, America's commitment to seek the peace and security of the world without nuclear weapons. And he added wisely in a subsequent speech, you must create the change you want to see. And so you have to ask yourself whether you think it's possible, whether you think it's desirable, whether you're willing to go to bat for it. And you're the sort of people who can, and I think will. And people will say to you, if you do start on that line, they'll say, look, human nature is not something you can change. Agree with them. You can't change human nature. Human behavior is what you're trying to change, and you can change human behavior. And let me just reminisce, because I'm old enough that my father lived in a time when people actually fought duels when they had a thorough disagreement, and he was an idiot enough to fight one. And in my childhood in Manchester, as a kid of 14, I used to read the Manchester Guardian, and in it said who was going to be flogged in the local jail. And actually they flogged them at intervals so that they had time to remember before the next flogging. And it said in the newspaper who was going to be hung in the local jail. These are things that are today unthinkable. They are changes in our behavior. They will never come back. And this is something of the same order that we should be urging on our countries. are in a good position to do it because we're right, and we're in a good position to do it because, you know, the essence of it is that this practice of keeping peace by threatening to destroy everything, Armageddon, is degrading and dangerous. So our leaders say they want to change it. So it's our task to see that they do. Thank you all.